Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Fuirst, and today I will be talking to you about some results from my first chapter of my dissertation in the Norris lab as part of the Integrative Biology department. This research focuses on dispersal patterns in Canada jays. Now first off, I want to give you an introduction to breeding dispersal as a concept. Breeding dispersal is defined by the movement of individuals from one breeding site to another. This could be moving from a breeding colony to a different breeding colony, or moving from one nest in part of a forest to a different part of a forest to breed somewhere else. But is always occurring amongst individuals that were previously reproductively active and then move to another location to reproduce in a subsequent season. Breeding dispersal is a multi-causal process that can influence metapopulation dynamics as well as genetic drift. Previous research has shown that both environmental and social factors are known to cause breeding dispersal, but many studies are still constrained in the data available to determine what these motivators actually are. Some key uncertainties that still exist in breeding dispersal studies are accurate estimates of mortality, and what I mean by this is known fates of individuals when they leave a given nesting area. A lot of studies infer that an individual has either left the population or died, but they still lack that known fate of those individuals after they leave a certain breeding site. Additionally, understanding the drivers of breeding dispersal are important when you incorporate demographic information such as previous reproductive success and age, which are only available when you are able to monitor individuals throughout a long period of time. I plan to determine how patterns of dispersal can change over time using a long-term data set that is acquired in our lab, as well as quantify the factors that influence the probability of dispersal occurring. I plan to do this for both mated and divorced pairs. So what I mean by this is we are interested in what influences whether or not dispersal happens for pairs that are still together, as well as once one mate disperses, leaving another mate widowed, what then influences the decisions of that individual, and do different factors influence those two decisions by separate breeders. Lastly, I aim to determine the factors that influence variation in dispersal distances. To tackle these objectives, I focused on a resident species of bird, the Canada jay. The Canada jay is a food-caching songbird that relies on cached food that it stores in the fall for overwinter survival and reproductive success. Canada jays are a resident species that inhabit the boreal and subalpine ecosystems of North America. Now, they're not migratory, hence resident, so they maintain year-round territories. These territories are associated with black spruce and tamarack. The territory quality measures are associated with these tree species because it is known that these two conifer species are best for preserving caches throughout the winter due to antibacterial properties in the resin. The study population of Canada jays that I focused on is in Algonquin Park, where this species has been monitored every breeding season since 1964. Over this period of time, which is about 55 years, approximately 25 territories have been monitored. This has ranged from finding their nests, then monitoring their nests throughout the breeding season to estimate clutch size and nest success, as well as monitoring the fledglings afterwards. To classify dispersal, we used a long-term data set that focuses on this study population. And throughout this entire data set of adult individuals, we looked at 295 males and 289 females that were studied between 1964 and 2019. Using this long-term data set, I quantified any breeding dispersal event when as an individual that switches territories between two consecutive breeding seasons. I excluded any instances of an individual that leaves a given territory but then is undetected for several years and then detected afterwards on a separate territory. Because even though this is technically breeding dispersal because we found it breeding somewhere else a few years later, we might be overestimating dispersal distances because the bird wasn't seen between the years in between. I measured distances of breeding dispersal using the nest locations that were collected using GPS devices each breeding season. So the dispersal distance was measured between the nest of the previous year where it reproduced to where it dispersed to and reproduced that subsequent season. To analyze what factors might be influencing the probability of dispersal occurring, I used generalized linear mixed models with a binary response variable being dispersal occurring or not. I did this for all of our individuals in the population, as well as running models using a subset of the data only focusing on the widowed individuals that then didn't have another mate. To look at factors that might be influencing variation in dispersal distance, I use linear mixed effect models using a log transform dispersal distance to keep it normally distributed. In addition, I use generalized linear models to look at long-term trends in dispersal events that occurred each year, the frequency of dispersal events that occurred each year, the proportion of breeding spots available that year, the mean dispersal distances that year across the entire population, and the frequency of double disappearances that occurred each year. Double disappearances meant that any time an individual left its territory and then the remaining individual also left, leaving that territory completely vacant. Now, for the generalized linear mixed models, I used a suite of predictors that are hypothesized to be possible motivators of breeding dispersal. This included demographic variables such as age and sex, which were used as fixed effects, as well as individual identity of each bird, which was incorporated as a random effect. We also included external and environmental variables that might be motivators of breeding dispersal. This included a binary fixed effect of mate loss, which was whether or not the mate disappeared that breeding season, density, which was the number of individuals in the population that year, habitat quality, which, like previously mentioned, was the percent of conifers on that given territory, specifically black spruce, the distance to the nearest available territory, and year, which is incorporated as another random effect. Now, after quantifying all of our dispersal data, we found that 64 instances of breeding dispersal occurred throughout the study period. No significant sex differences were apparent in the frequency of dispersal events over the 50-plus years. But amongst all of the dispersers, both males and females tended to be older when dispersing than individuals that remained on territory, which is being philopatric. Those individuals were more often to be younger. When looking at the long-term trends of dispersal patterns in this population, we see significant increases over time for 3 out of 4 of the variables that we looked at. When looking at the frequency per year of double disappearances, or simply the numbers of individuals that dispersed across the study population, we see a significant increase over time. Now, in each of these 4 plots, we have our 4 different response variables on the y-axis, but for all 4 of the plots, year from 1964 to 2019 is the x-axis. And as you can see in the top 2 panels, the number of individuals that dispersed over time and the number of double disappearances that occurred over time significantly increased. We also saw an increase in mean dispersal distances over time. And lastly, the proportion of breeding opportunities also gradually increased over time, but this was barely significant. When looking at the results of our GLMMs, we found that for all mated pairs, the probability of dispersal was significantly influenced by mate loss. Our top 4 best models all included mate loss and the distance to the nearest territory as fixed effects, thus inferring that those 2 variables significantly influence the probability of dispersal occurring, since our best fit models included those fixed effects. The plot here in this slide is demonstrating the number of dispersal events for individuals that stayed and individuals that their mate disappeared. So on the left, on the y-axis, you have proportion of dispersal events. And for each stacked column, we have whether or not that partner's mate disappeared or was present, which is represented on the x-axis. And then the proportion of dispersal events that happened as the dark shading blue. And as you can see, amongst individuals where their mate disappeared, dispersal happened more frequently. In addition to this, amongst individuals that were widowed and their partner had already left, we found that the distance to the nearest available territory, as well as habitat quality, caused individuals to disperse more often. When looking at dispersal distances, sex was a prevalent variable in the top 4 best models of our linear mixed effect models. And as you can see in the frequency histogram on your left, females tended to travel farther than males did when dispersing. In addition, we saw a positive correlation between dispersal distance and the distance to the nearest available territory, suggesting that when the territory is closer by and has a vacancy there potentially, individuals are more likely to disperse, and those dispersal distances being shorter. So in conclusion, we see that the frequency and distances of breeding dispersal have increased over time from 1964 to 2019. We don't know the mechanisms between these, but these patterns are existent. The propensity to disperse is different based on whether or not you're in a pair bond or if you're a widowed individual, which is important because for further studies on breeding dispersal, whether or not you're alone or with your mate should be considered as 2 different processes, which might be influenced by separate variables. When looking at breeding dispersal distances, we found that it was sex bias, which is consistent with previous literature suggesting female biased dispersal distances. And in addition, the decision to disperse and how far to go when you do disperse are 2 separate processes, which should be considered using separate analyses. I would like to thank Algonquin Provincial Park and all of the collaborators that have helped us conduct the research in that park over the past 50 years, inclusive of the years that I've been a part of this study, as well as all of the Norris lab members that have helped collect this data. In addition, I would like to thank local volunteers to the Huntsville and Algonquin area that have always been willing to help us nest search and monitor these birds. Thank you very much.